33-year-old Claudia Vance sat in a midtown law office, watching her father attempt to dismantle her worth for the final time. The room smelled of expensive mahogany and betrayal, as Alberto adjusted his fake gold cufflinks in front of the silent lawyer and my smirking sister. "Investing in a daughter who isn't married yet is like throwing hard currency into a bonfire," he declared, his voice echoing against the cold floor-to-ceiling glass. I didn't flinch or let a single tear compromise my clinical mask, while I watched a bead of sweat roll down his temple. The wood is gone. What happened when the lawyer opened the final envelope is a debt I am finally here to collect. Growing up in our Upper East Side brownstone felt like living inside one of my father's early blueprints, rigid, calculated, and focused on the structural integrity of the public facade. Alberto Vance didn't just design buildings, he designed people. At the dinner table, the hierarchy was as fixed as a load-bearing wall. Beatrice sat to his right, bathed in the glow of his approval, her minor accomplishments celebrated like completed skyscrapers. She was the decorative element, the marble finish that justified the cost. I was relegated to the periphery, seated at the corner where the light from the chandelier didn't quite reach. My father would discuss the expansion of his firm while looking through me, as if I were a drafting error he had forgotten to erase. He spoke of legacies and grooming a successor, his eyes always lingering on the space beside Beatrice, never considering the daughter who was already correcting his structural calculations in her head. Visibility was a currency I didn't possess. The division of worth became a matter of public record during a summer dinner when the humidity outside matched the suffocating tension within our dining room. Alberto had just finalized the budget for Beatrice's wedding, a $250,000 spectacle involving imported peonies and a venue that felt more like a cathedral than a ballroom. When I placed my MBA acceptance letter on the table and asked for the remaining $20,000 my scholarship didn't cover, the air in the room didn't just cool, it froze. My father didn't look at the letter. He looked at his wine glass and spoke with the clinical detachment of an appraiser rejecting a damaged antique. He told me that investing in a daughter who wasn't married yet was equivalent to throwing hard currency into a bonfire. He explained his internal logic as if he were teaching me a lesson in fiscal responsibility. Beatrice was a guaranteed return on social capital, while my ambition was a high-risk venture without dividends. During those years, my grandmother Margaret was a quiet fixture in the background, a silent witness who occupied the spaces my father ignored. She was always there, seated in her velvet armchair by the window, her hands moving rhythmically as she embroidered patterns that no one else bothered to examine. While Alberto lectured us on the necessity of useful family members, Margaret would occasionally catch my eye, a brief contact that conveyed more than a lifetime of his speeches. She never interrupted his tirades or defended me openly. She was a master of the invisible architecture of our lives. I remember her watching me pack my bags for Chicago, her expression unreadable, almost clinical in its stillness. What I didn't understand then was that Margaret wasn't just watching me suffer. She was documenting the debt. She saw the way I absorbed the humiliation without a flinch, noting every time Alberto diminished my value. She was the only person who looked at the foundation instead of the facade. On June 14, 2015, at precisely 8:42 p.m., the air in our Upper East Side dining room was thick with the scent of rosemary-crusted lamb and the suffocating weight of Beatrice's impending nuptials. A cream-colored folder sat beside my father's crystal wine glass, containing a line-item invoice for $250,000, the cost of a single day of choreographed happiness. I remember the exact texture of the linen napkin I gripped beneath the table as I placed my acceptance letter from the University of Chicago beside his plate. I didn't ask for a gift. I asked for a bridge, a $20,000 loan to cover the gap my scholarship left open. Alberto didn't even put down his fork. He looked at the invoice for the floral arrangements, $30,000 for peonies that would wither in 48 hours, and then at my future. The silence lasted 12 seconds, measured by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer, while the light from the chandelier glittered off his silver cufflinks. Investing in a daughter who isn't married yet is like throwing hard currency into a bonfire. "Claudia," my father said, his voice as steady as a structural beam. He took a slow sip of a 2005 Bordeaux, the liquid staining his lips a deep, bruised purple. He explained his internal logic with the practiced ease of a man who believed his prejudices were actually economic laws. To him, Beatrice was a finished project, a landmark building that would increase the Vance family's social equity through a strategic marriage. I was merely a renovation he couldn't justify. My mother adjusted her pearl necklace, her eyes fixed on the centerpiece, her silence a signed confession of complicity. Beatrice smiled, a small, sharp movement of her lips as she traced the embossed gold lettering on her wedding invitations. Nobody looked at me. I watched the condensation on my water glass drip onto the table, a tiny, localized flood that mirrored the quiet erosion of my place in that house. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or allow a single tear to compromise the clinical mask I had spent 2 decades perfecting. I simply folded the letter, the creases sharp enough to draw blood, and stood up with a measured grace that felt like a declaration of war. That night, I packed a single suitcase with clothes that didn't bear the Vance crest, leaving behind the designer labels and the hollow expectations of a life lived in the shadows of Beatrice's marble facade. I signed for predatory student loans at 4 in the morning, the interest rates a mathematical representation of my father's betrayal. As I walked toward the service exit at dawn, the city was a gray, indifferent monolith. I didn't look back at the brownstone. I had exactly $412 in my checking account and a singular, ironclad decision. I would build a kingdom where Alberto Vance was not even a footnote. The transition from an Upper East Side brownstone to a 400-square-foot studio in Chicago's Hyde Park was a lesson in thermodynamics and structural integrity. I remember the exact sound of the radiator, a rhythmic, metallic clanking that signaled the struggle of an aging boiler against the Illinois winter. My father's mahogany-scented study was replaced by the faint, persistent smell of floor wax and over-steeped coffee from the corner bodega. I survived on 89-cent cans of black beans and the calculated adrenaline of someone who had nothing left to lose but her dignity. While Beatrice was busy selecting Italian marble, I was measuring the distance between my student loan payments and my remaining $4 of weekly discretionary income. I worked 36 hours a week at a logistics firm while maintaining a 4.0 GPA, treating my exhaustion as a necessary overhead cost for the independence I was purchasing. I didn't call home for Thanksgiving. I spent that Thursday calculating the compound interest on my debt, a number far more honest than Alberto's. By my second year in the MBA program, I had become a master of the invisible architecture of power, understanding that most empires are built on the fine print people are too lazy to read. I lived in the library, a space where fluorescent lights buzzed with the same frequency as my anxiety, yet I never let my hands shake. I secured a junior analyst role at a strategy firm, earning $62,000 a year, a sum Alberto would have considered a rounding error. I didn't buy new clothes. I polished my old shoes until they mirrored the glass of the Loop's skyscrapers. I was building a persona that was surgically precise and emotionally impenetrable, a version of myself that could dismantle a competitor's share without raising her voice. Every promotion was a brick in a wall I was building between myself and the Vance legacy. I wasn't just working. I was accumulating the tactical data required to ensure that when I finally saw my father again, I held power. In November of 2018, a small, hand-addressed envelope arrived at my office, its cream-colored stationery a stark contrast to the digital environment of my desk. It was from Margaret. Inside was no check, no grand gesture of financial salvation that would have undermined my struggle, but a single pressed hydrangea from her Hamptons garden and a note written in her steady cursive. She wrote about the importance of deep foundations in sandy soil, a metaphor that felt more like a blueprint than a sentiment. She mentioned a small savings account she had opened in my name when I was 6, one Alberto had forgotten existed. It contained exactly $3,412, the interest of decades of forgotten birthday gifts and loose change. It wasn't enough to pay off my loans, but it covered 3 months of rent when my firm was restructuring. Margaret wasn't just providing liquidity. She was signaling that she had seen the ledger of my father's neglect and was quietly balancing the books. 5 years later, I was the strategy director for a firm specializing in distressed asset acquisition, a role that required the cold-blooded ability to see value where others saw only ruin. I was earning a base salary of $280,000, plus performance bonuses that exceeded the cost of Beatrice's entire wedding. I had moved into a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, a space of glass and silence that felt like a sanctuary from the noise of my childhood. I had repaid every cent of my predatory loans, the final payment of $12,000 sent on a Tuesday afternoon at 3:14 p.m., with a feeling of absolute clinical closure. I was no longer the daughter sitting in the shadows of a chandelier. I was the architect of my own sovereign state. My name appeared in industry journals that my father read over his morning espresso, though he never made the connection between the IC. Vance is cited for her aggressive market expansions and the girl he had dismissed. The irony of our divergent paths began to crystallize when my firm was approached by a developer seeking a hostile takeover of a boutique architectural firm in Manhattan. I sat in a high-backed chair, reviewing a confidential dossier that detailed a liquidity crisis at his firm, triggered by a series of over-leveraged projects in the Hudson Yards. Alberto had bet the family's remaining capital on a luxury tower that was now 60% vacant, his internal logic failing him for the first time in 40 years. He was looking for a white knight, a strategic partner with enough capital to bridge his debt, unaware that the primary consultant for the acquisition was the daughter he had once dismissed as a waste of currency. I spent 3 hours analyzing his firm's crumbling debt-to-equity ratio, noting the $64,000 he had spent on a private jet for Beatrice's anniversary, while his payroll accounts were nearly empty. He was bleeding out in slow motion, his pride the only thing keeping the structure. The call about Margaret's passing came on a Tuesday, the same day I finalized a $10 million expansion for my firm into the London market. Her death was a quiet conclusion to a life lived in observation, but the legal summons to the estate reading was a different kind of signal. I knew that returning to New York meant stepping back into the mahogany-scented theater of my father's delusions, but I also knew I was no longer an extra in his play. I spent the flight from Chicago to LaGuardia reviewing the audit report, my eyes tracking the red ink that marked the end of his empire. I wore a charcoal gray suit from a designer he couldn't afford, and a watch that cost more than the tuition he had refused me 8 years prior. As the plane banked over the Manhattan skyline, the lights looked like a spreadsheet of possibilities. I wasn't going back for a funeral. I was going back to witness the final, inevitable structure collapse. 10:02 a.m., Midtown Manhattan. The elevator doors opened with a muted, expensive chime. I stepped onto the plush carpet of the law firm where my father had spent 30 years cultivating the illusion of permanence. Alberto was already seated, his posture a masterclass in performative authority, despite the fact that his firm's accounts were currently hemorrhaging $400,000 a month. He looked at me, his eyes tracking the cut of my charcoal gray blazer with the clinical precision of an architect measuring a rival's structural integrity. Beside him, Beatrice adjusted a Cartier bracelet that caught the harsh morning light, her expression one of practiced boredom. The air was thick with the scent of mahogany polish and that same sandalwood cologne he had worn the night he told me I was a bad investment. I didn't sit immediately. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the yellow cabs that resembled microscopic gold bars moving through the city's gray arteries. The conference table was a massive slab of African Macassar, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the hollow expectations of everyone in the room. I finally took the seat furthest from my father, mirroring the spatial hierarchy he had established at our dinner table 20 years ago. The lawyer, a man named Henderson, with a voice like dry parchment, began shuffling through the estate documents of my grandmother Margaret. I watched the way Alberto's fingers drummed a rhythmic, anxious pattern on the wood, a tell he only exhibited when he was calculating the distance between his pride and a total collapse. He spoke first, his voice carrying that familiar, resonant timbre designed to fill boardrooms and drown out dissent. He mentioned the unfortunate timing of Margaret's passing, framing her death as a logistical inconvenience to his current project. He was already mentally auctioning off her assets to cover the interest on his over-leveraged Hudson Yards development. Beatrice leaned forward, the scent of her expensive, floral perfume cutting through the sterile atmosphere of the law office like a blunt instrument. She spoke of family legacy and the responsibility we all shared to protect the Vance name during these trying economic transitions. It was a scripted performance, likely rehearsed over lunch at Le Coucou, designed to guilt me into offering the liquidity they so desperately needed. She looked at my watch, a limited edition Patek Philippe I had purchased with my first 7-figure bonus, and I saw the flicker of calculated greed in her eyes. It was the same look she had when she picked out her $30,000 peonies for a wedding that lasted 6 hours and cost $250,000. They didn't see a daughter or a sister. They saw a distressed asset that could be flipped for an immediate return. I remained silent, a clinical observer of my own family's desperate, high-stakes theater. Alberto shifted his weight, the heavy leather chair creaking under the pressure of a man who realized his influence was a depreciating currency. He began to outline the strategic opportunities for the family to consolidate their resources, his language carefully avoiding the word bailout, as if it were a structural flaw. He spoke for 7 minutes, a monologue filled with architectural metaphors about foundations and shared structural loads, his eyes never quite meeting mine. He was trying to bridge the gap between his previous dismissal of my value and his current need for my capital, without acknowledging the 8 years of silence that sat between us like a canyon. I noted the precise moment his voice wavered, at the mention of the firm's $64 million debt obligation. He looked at me then, his expression a fragile mask of fatherly pride that didn't quite reach his eyes, waiting for me to offer a solution. The silence that followed his speech was absolute, a pressurized vacuum that seemed to make the mahogany table vibrate with the unspoken history of our resentment. I waited exactly 12 seconds before shifting my gaze from the window to the man who had once valued a floral arrangement over my education. The trigger came not in a shout, but in the casual, devastating way he attempted to rewrite our shared past to suit his current financial reality. He cleared his throat and smiled, a gesture that felt like a crack in a drying cement foundation. "I always knew you had the Vance grit, Claudia," he said, his tone dripping with a synthetic warmth that made my skin crawl. "That's why I pushed you so hard back then. I knew that by denying you that small loan for your MBA, I was forging the director I see before me today." He watched me with calculated expectation. He continued, his internal logic rearranging the trauma of my youth into a deliberate, pedagogical strategy he now claimed credit for. He suggested that my success was a direct result of his tough love, and that I should be grateful for the economic discipline he had instilled in me by forcing me into predatory debt. Beatrice nodded in agreement, adding that she had sacrificed her own career aspirations to maintain the family's social standing while I was away, playing in the Chicago markets. The audacity of her statement, considering her career consisted of 3 months as an unpaid intern at a gallery her father funded, was a mathematical absurdity. I watched a single bead of sweat roll down Alberto's temple, the only honest thing in the room. He was betting everything on the hope that I still craved his approval enough to pay for his survival. I adjusted the vintage fountain pen on the table. I felt the silence that had protected me for nearly a decade begin to suffocate me, transformed from a shield into a cage. For years, I had believed that my absence was my victory, but as I looked at Alberto's smug, desperate face, I realized that my silence was actually his accomplice. He interpreted my lack of protest as a sign that his narrative was holding, that he could continue to build his house of cards on the foundation of my suppressed anger. The heat rose in the back of my neck, a sharp, clinical focus sharpening my vision until I could see the individual threads in his silk tie. This was the final boundary, the moment where the Vance family's pathological need to be right collided with the objective reality of their cruelty. I gripped the cool edge of the Macassar wood table, my breathing becoming a rhythmic, almost mechanical measurement of the mounting tension. I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the cold, measured precision of a surgeon announcing a terminal diagnosis. "The thing about fires, Alberto," I said, my voice cutting through the sandalwood-scented air like a blade, "is that they eventually run out of wood to burn." His smile faltered, the imitation gold of his cufflinks suddenly looking dull against the dark wood of the table. He didn't understand that I wasn't there to be his white knight. I was there to witness the structural failure I had predicted 8 years ago. I looked at Beatrice, whose Cartier bracelet now looked like a shackle, and then back at the man who had called me a bad investment. The room felt smaller, the mahogany walls closing in as the lawyer reached for the final, sealed envelope that bore my grandmother's distinctive, elegant handwriting. I felt a strange, cold peace descend upon the room. Alberto attempted to regain control of the narrative, dismissively mentioning that Margaret had likely left her Hamptons property to a local bird sanctuary or some other romantic charity. He spoke of her as if she were a flighty, unreliable witness to his greatness, unaware that she had spent the last 20 years documenting his every failure. He was so certain of his own importance that he couldn't conceive of a world where his mother would prioritize a worthless daughter over his legacy. He looked at his watch, a nervous habit that betrayed his desire to finish the reading and get back to the failing construction site he called a life. The lawyer cleared his throat, the sound of the envelope being sliced open echoing in the quiet room like a gunshot. The tension in the air was palpable, a physical weight that made breathing difficult. We all sat in the shadow of Margaret's final, silent judgment. As Henderson pulled the single sheet of cream-colored stationery from the envelope, I noticed the way the light from the chandelier glittered off the lawyer's spectacles. Alberto was already leaning back, his arms crossed over his chest in a posture of arrogant expectation, ready to dismiss whatever pittance Margaret had left behind. He didn't know that the letter inside would dismantle the very foundation of his identity, or that the romantic grandmother he dismissed had been my secret ally for a lifetime. I could see the first line of the letter from my position at the table, the ink dark and unwavering. The silence in the room reached its maximum threshold, the kind of stillness that precedes a total structural collapse. I gripped the edge of the Macassar table, my knuckles turning white, as the lawyer prepared to read the words that would change everything forever. I waited for the sound of the first truth to break, Henderson's voice remained a steady, dry drone as he read the words that effectively dismantled my father's remaining dignity. The letter revealed that Margaret hadn't donated the Hamptons' property to a bird sanctuary or any other romantic charity Alberto had imagined. She had sold it in 2016 at the height of the market and placed the proceeds into a private irrevocable trust. The current valuation sat at $512,486. Alberto's hands, which had been resting with such practiced authority on the Macassar wood, suddenly looked small and trembling. The room's temperature seemed to drop by 10 degrees as the lawyer read the final line of my grandmother's message. I saw everything. I always did. It wasn't a sentimental farewell. It was a forensic audit of a decade of neglect. I watched the color drain from Alberto's face, leaving behind a gray, sallow mask that revealed the true extent of his internal structural failure. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a heavy, pressurized atmosphere filled with the ghost of my father's previous insults. Alberto's eyes darted toward the document as if he could rewrite the numbers through sheer force of will. He was mentally calculating the exact gap in his Hudson Yards project, a gap that measured precisely $480,000. The irony was a mathematical perfection that even I hadn't anticipated. Margaret had known the exact price of his survival and had placed it just beyond his reach, handing the keys to the daughter he had dismissed as a fiscal liability. I sat perfectly still, my spine a vertical line of cold, unyielding iron, watching him process the fact that his mother had prioritized my future over his vanity. He looked at the lawyer, then at Beatrice, and finally at me, his mouth opening and closing like a landing gear that refused to lock into place. Beatrice's reaction was a study in shallow, decorative panic, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts that rattled the Cartier bracelet on her wrist. She looked at the figure on the paper, $500,000, and I could see her comparing it to the cost of her wedding, a $250,000 spectacle that had bought her nothing but a temporary social high. The bad investment my father had once decried was now the only liquid asset the Vance family possessed. She tried to speak, to offer some platitude about family unity, but the words died in her throat as she caught my gaze. I looked at her with the clinical detachment of an observer monitoring a failed experiment. She was the marble finish on a building with a cracked foundation, beautiful to look at but structurally irrelevant in the face of a total collapse. The light from the chandelier seemed to focus exclusively on the cream-colored stationery. Alberto attempted to regain his footing, his voice cracking as he reached for the tattered remains of his paternal authority. He suggested that the trust was intended to be managed by the firm, framing it as a strategic reserve for the collective Vance legacy. He spoke of reinvestment and shared responsibilities, his language a desperate attempt to ignore the fact that the money was legally and exclusively mine. He was a man drowning in a sea of red ink, trying to convince the lifeguard that he was actually performing a complex synchronized swimming routine. I watched him, noting the precise angle of his desperation, the way his sandalwood cologne now smelled like cold sweat and defeat. He didn't ask for the money. He demanded it under the guise of family duty, still believing that his logic could override the objective reality of Margaret's will. It was the last, pathetic gasp of a dying empire. I didn't let him finish his monologue about family legacies and structural loads. I stood up, the movement slow and deliberate, the fabric of my charcoal blazer making a crisp, expensive sound in the quiet room. I placed my own tablet on the table, displaying the audit report of his firm's $64 million debt obligation. I don't need Margaret's money, Alberto, I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat in a vacuum. I earned twice that amount in performance bonuses last year alone. The revelation that I was already wealthier than his failing firm was the final blow, a data point that crashed through his remaining defenses. I watched his eyes track the numbers on the screen, the realization dawning on him that I wasn't just a successful daughter. I was a sovereign power. I wasn't a bridge he could cross. I was a fortress he could never hope to besiege. The power shift was absolute. The legal reality of the trust was a surgical strike against his ego. Henderson confirming that the funds were protected by 3 layers of fiduciary oversight that excluded Alberto entirely. My father's firm was facing a liquidity crisis that would result in a total asset seizure within 48 hours, and he had spent the last 20 minutes insulting the only person with the capability to provide a bailout. He sat back, his shoulders slumping as the weight of his own cruelty finally settled on him. He looked at the daughter he had once compared to a bonfire, realizing that I hadn't burned his money. I had used the heat to forge a weapon. The silence in the room was now a graveyard for his delusions. He looked smaller, the heavy mahogany chair finally overwhelming his diminished frame. He had built his life on the belief that he was the only architect in the room. I reached for my grandmother's vintage fountain pen and signed the acknowledgement forms with a flourish that felt like the final period on a long, exhausting sentence. I didn't look back at Alberto or Beatrice as I gathered my things. My flight to London was scheduled for 6:15 p.m., a one-way ticket to expand my firm's territory into a market where the name Vance carried no weight other than the one I gave it. The thing about foundations, Alberto, I said, pausing at the door with my hand on the cool brass handle, is that they don't care about the feelings of the architect. They only care about the truth of the load. I walked out of the office, my heels clicking against the marble floor with a rhythmic, measured precision. I didn't run, and I didn't look back at the wreckage. The air outside was cold, sharp, and perfectly clear. 48 hours after the meeting in Midtown, the structural collapse of Alberto Vance's empire began with the removal of the brass signage from the entrance of his Madison Avenue office. I watched the live feed from a security camera I had authorized through the distressed asset acquisition firm, noting that it took exactly 3 minutes for a worker in orange overalls to unscrew the legacy my father had spent 40 years building. The cost of the signage removal was billed at $4,000. $200. A minor line item in a bankruptcy filing that totaled $64 million in liabilities. I was sitting in the Virgin Atlantic Clubhouse at JFK, watching the rain streak the glass in patterns that resembled the chaotic red ink on his firm's balance sheets. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I felt the cold, familiar satisfaction of a mathematical proof finally reaching its inevitable conclusion. The sandalwood scent of his presence was finally being scrubbed from the city's registry. By the time my flight landed at Heathrow, the liquidation of the Vance family assets had moved from a theoretical threat to a forensic reality. Alberto's primary operating accounts were frozen by a court order at 9:14 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, leaving him with a liquid balance of exactly $814, less than the cost of one of his signature silk ties. I reviewed the notification on my encrypted tablet while waiting for my driver, noting the precise timing of the freeze. It was a digital guillotine that didn't care about his reputation or the load-bearing walls he had designed in the 70s. He was suddenly a man with a prestigious name and no way to pay for a taxi home from the office. The internal logic he had used to dismiss my $20,000 education was now being applied to him by a banking system that valued collateral over charisma. I watched the London fog roll in. Beatrice's response to the crisis was a frantic, uncoordinated purge of her digital existence, a desperate attempt to hide the evidence of her $250,000 wedding from the bankruptcy trustees. At 2:42 p.m., her Instagram account, which had been a curated gallery of imported peonies and Italian marble, vanished into the ether. I knew she was sitting in her sprawling apartment, looking at the $30,000 floral arrangements that were now nothing more than rotting organic matter in the eyes of the creditors. She had spent years building a facade of social capital that had a resale value of zero. The irony of her situation was a mathematical perfection. She was surrounded by luxury she couldn't liquidate, and a husband who was already consulting his own lawyers about the strategic dissolution of their marriage. She was a decorative element in a building that was being condemned for structural failure, and the marble was starting to crack. I settled into my new office on the 42nd floor of the Shard, a space of glass and steel that hummed with the quiet, efficient energy of a $10 million expansion. My father's name didn't exist here. The only name on the door was mine, written in a font that was clean, modern, and utterly indifferent to the architectural traditions of Manhattan. I spent my first week in London reviewing the acquisition of 3 distressed firms in the Eurozone. My decisions based on data points that Alberto wouldn't even know how to measure. I earned a performance bonus of $400,000 in my first 90 days, a sum that would have covered his Hudson Yards interest payments twice over. I didn't send him a check. I sent him a copy of my quarterly report, the numbers printed in a black ink that offered no warmth and even less hope for a bailout. The first email from my mother arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the funeral. The subject line was simply, "Family Matters," a phrase that had always been used in our house as a precursor to a demand for emotional or financial sacrifice. She spoke of Alberto's declining health, a vague heart condition that she conveniently attributed to the stress of my sudden departure. It was a classic Vance maneuver, an attempt to weaponize guilt to bridge a liquidity gap that her own silence had helped create. I replied exactly 72 hours later, my response a model of clinical brevity that would have made a Victorian headmaster proud. I informed her that I had already arranged for a private nursing service to evaluate my father, the cost of which would be deducted from his future inheritance from Margaret's trust, which, as she knew, was exactly zero. I didn't ask how she was. The foreclosure of the Upper East Side brownstone was finalized on a Thursday in November. The same day I closed a deal to acquire a logistics hub in Berlin. The auction price was $12 million, $400,000, a figure that left the family exactly $2 million short of their primary debt obligations to the construction lenders. I watched the sale through a proxy bidder, ensuring that the mahogany dining table and the Macassar conference slab were sold to a boutique hotel group in Brooklyn. The physical environment of my childhood was being dismantled and sold off as vintage luxury to people who didn't know the sound of a daughter's dreams being dismissed in that room. Alberto moved into a 2-bedroom rental in Queens, the air smelling of industrial detergent and the exhaust of the nearby expressway. He was finally living in the economy he had once tried to force me into. As I watched the lights of London flicker below me, I thought of the thousands of you who are watching this right now, perhaps sitting at a table that feels just as cold as mine did in 2015. You know the exact weight of being told your dreams are a bad investment, a fiscal liability in a family that values a decorative wedding over a daughter's future. Have you ever felt that specific, sharp sting of being dismissed by the people who were supposed to be your foundation? I want you to tell me in the comments, what was the moment you realized you had to build your own kingdom? Sharing your story isn't just about catharsis. It's about documenting the debt that will one day be repaid with interest. Stay with me, because the next layer of this story reveals exactly what happens when the bad investment becomes the only person with the power to sign the checks. Alberto's health didn't fail, but his ego underwent a total system reboot that left him a shadow of the man who had once lectured me on economic discipline. He began calling me from a prepaid phone at odd hours, his voice thin and reedy, stripped of the resonant authority that had once filled our brownstone. He didn't ask for money directly. His pride still had a few load-bearing beams left, but he spoke of collaborative opportunities and mentorship roles within my firm. He was trying to sell me his failure as if it were a valuable case study in architectural resilience. I listened to his monologues for exactly 5 minutes each time, my finger hovering over the end call button as I timed his desperation against my own schedule. I never gave him an answer. I gave him silence, a commodity he had once gifted me when I asked for a future. Beatrice's divorce was filed on the first anniversary of her $250,000 wedding, a poetic bit of timing that I noted in my personal ledger with a small, sharp checkmark. Her husband, a man whose primary contribution to the family was a list of high-net-worth contacts, had determined that a bankrupt sister-in-law was a liability to his own brand. She was left with a settlement that barely covered the storage fees for her designer wardrobe and the remaining payments on a car she could no longer afford to insure. She called me once, her voice choked with a victimhood that was as shallow as her previous arrogance. She asked for a small bridge loan to get her through the transition. I told her I would consider it only after a full forensic audit of her personal spending from 2015 to the present. She hung up. She knew the ledger wouldn't survive the scrutiny. The Margaret Foundation was officially launched on January 15th, a venture capital fund dedicated exclusively to providing interest-free loans to female students in MBA programs who were facing family rejection. I used the initial $500,000 from the trust as the seed capital, naming the first 3 grants after the specific dates my father had humiliated me in public. It was a strategic deployment of Margaret's legacy, turning the money Alberto had coveted into a weapon that dismantled his worldview one student at a time. I didn't send a press release to the Vance family, but I knew Alberto would see the announcement in the Financial Times. I wanted him to see the $500,000 figure, the exact price of his survival, being handed out to strangers whose grit reminded me of the girl he had once called a fire. The letters from my grandmother Margaret, which I found in a safe deposit box in the City of London, were more than just financial documents. They were a roadmap of a woman who chose to love in silence. She saw the dinner in 2015, the way the lamb grew cold, and the way my father's eyes turned into stones. I realize now that many of you have a Margaret in your life, someone who doesn't speak up in the moment, but who is quietly preparing your victory years before you even know you've won. Who was that person for you? Was it a teacher, a grandparent, or perhaps a stranger who saw your value when your own family chose to look away? Type their name in the comments to honor their silent architecture. We are approaching the final payoff of this journey, and you won't want to miss the conditions I set for my father's survival. By the second year of my London expansion, the name C. Vance was synonymous with a specific kind of aggressive, data-driven success that made the Manhattan architectural elite nervous. I didn't hide my identity, I simply outpaced it, making the Vance legacy look like a quaint, Victorian relic compared to the multinational infrastructure projects I was now spearheading. I purchased a townhouse in Belgravia, a space of white stone and high ceilings that I filled with art from designers Alberto had never even heard of. I was no longer the daughter who was invisible at the dinner table. I was the gravity around which the industry moved. My father was reduced to reading about my successes in the very journals he used to use as props for his authority. He was a spectator in the life of the daughter he had once refused to invest in, watching the dividends grow from a distance he couldn't bridge. My mother eventually flew to London, her arrival unannounced and her expectations as high as they were 8 years ago. She stayed at a mid-range hotel because I refused to book her a suite at the Savoy. A decision I explained was based on current market volatilities. We sat in a sterile, glass-walled meeting room in the Shard, the city of London laid out beneath us like a map of my conquests. She didn't apologize for the dinner in 2015. She spoke of unfortunate misunderstandings and the importance of family unity during this season of transition. It was a performance that lacked the necessary foundation of truth to be convincing. I placed a single document on the table between us, a bill for $20,000, adjusted for 8 years of compound interest at 18%. "This is the price of a conversation, Mother," I said, my voice as cold as the glass beside us. She looked at the figure, nearly $60,000, and her hands began to shake, the pearls at her neck clicking together like a countdown. She explained that they didn't have that kind of money anymore, that Alberto was living on Social Security and a small, dwindling pension. I watched her, noting the way her perfume, the same expensive and floral scent she had worn at Beatrice's wedding, now smelled like desperation. I didn't flinch. I told her that if Alberto wanted to speak to me, he would have to acknowledge the debt in writing and provide a full, public apology to Margaret for his dismissal of her romanticism. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for a balanced ledger. She left London 48 hours later, her departure as quiet and unremarked as her arrival. I didn't pay for her flight back to New York. I had already paid enough for that family's delusions. The final liquidation of the Vance architecture assets occurred on a Tuesday in March, the same day I turned 33. The drafting tables where I had once done my homework were sold for $200 each to a group of architecture students who had no idea they were buying the remnants of a fallen empire. Alberto spent the morning in his Queen's apartment, likely reading my latest interview in the Wall Street Journal, where I discussed the necessity of deep foundations and ethical structural loads. He was now the primary consumer of the legacy he had claimed I would consume. The irony was a clinical perfection that required no further commentary. I didn't feel anger, and I didn't feel pity. I felt the same calm, rhythmic peace that comes when a complex calculation finally settles into a single, undeniable zero. I had survived the fire, and I had used the heat to build something that would outlast them all. My physical transformation was a reflection of the internal architecture I had been perfecting since that night in 2015. I walked with a posture that was a vertical declaration of power, my steps measured, and without the frantic energy of someone who still had something to prove. I had replaced my father's sandalwood with a scent of my own, sharp, clean, and entirely modern. People in boardrooms didn't see a daughter or a sister. They saw a sovereign power who moved with the clinical precision of a surgeon. I had learned that silence was the most powerful load-bearing wall in any structure, and I used it to protect the kingdom I had built in Chicago and London. I was no longer the girl sitting at the edge of the chandelier's light. I was the one who controlled the switch. The Vance legacy was dead, but the Vance grit was alive, and it belonged exclusively to me. The fire my father had once predicted would consume his money had indeed occurred, but it hadn't burned his capital. It had burned his house of cards. I realized that his internal logic was never about economics. It was about the fear of a daughter who could see through the marble facade to the crumbling brick beneath. He had tried to starve me of oxygen to keep his own flame alive, but he hadn't realized that I was the one who knew how to manage the vents. As I looked out at the London skyline, the lights reflecting off my Patek Philippe, I knew that the bad investment had become the most successful asset in the family's history. The satisfaction wasn't in the money or the power. It was in the absolute, unyielding truth of the ledger. I had won because I had been willing to stand in the cold until I learned how to build my own sun. Beatrice eventually found work as a junior consultant at a mid-tier gallery, her decorative life finally being put to a practical, if lowly, use. She earned $45,000 a year, a sum she had once spent on a single weekend in the Hamptons. She lived in a small studio in Brooklyn, the air smelling of the same industrial detergent as our father's apartment. We didn't speak. I didn't hate her. I simply didn't have a column for her in my current projections. She was a ghost from a previous era, a reminder of the cost of being a guaranteed return in a system that was built on a lie. I watched her life from a distance, noting the way she finally began to understand the value of a dollar she had actually earned. It was a lesson that had cost her everything, but at least the foundation was finally made of something more honest than her father's pride. The first recipient of the Margaret Foundation MBA grant, a woman named Elena who had been disowned for refusing an arranged marriage, graduated at the top of her class at Booth. I attended the ceremony in Chicago, sitting in the front row as she spoke about the importance of silent allies and the power of a woman who knows her own worth. She didn't know the full story of the money that had funded her education, but she knew the feeling of being a fire that someone tried to put out. I felt a rare, genuine warmth as I watched her walk across the stage. The $20,000 investment I had made in her future already yielding dividends in the form of a brilliant, unyielding career. I realized then that Margaret's legacy wasn't just about a trust fund. It was about the continuation of a lineage of women who saw everything and said nothing until it was time to change the world. The Macassar conference table from the Midtown office was eventually listed for sale again, and this time I bought it through an anonymous holding company. I had it shipped to my office in London and placed it in the center of my largest conference room, the dark, polished wood a mirror for the new reality I had created. I didn't use it for meetings. I used it as a reminder of the night the silence broke. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit at the corner where the light didn't reach, my hands resting on the cool wood, and I would remember the smell of sandalwood and the sound of my father's fork hitting the plate. I didn't feel the old pain. I felt the weight of the structure I had built on top of that memory. A building that was tall, strong, and perfectly balanced. The table was no longer a theater of my humiliation. It was a trophy of my survival. As the months turned into years, the Vance family became a case study in my lectures on strategic asset mismanagement and the failure of internal logic. I used our story, names changed, of course, to teach the next generation of directors why a decorative finish can never save a building with a cracked foundation. Alberto was the antagonist in the case study. A man who valued social capital over structural integrity and lost everything as a result. I watched my students analyze his decisions with a clinical coldness that mirrored my own, their young faces illuminated by the light of a world that no longer had room for men like him. I was the architect of his historical record, ensuring that his failure was documented with the same forensic precision that Margaret had used in her letters. The bad investment was now the one who was writing the textbook on how to succeed. The final transition from the aftermath to the plateau came on a quiet Sunday afternoon in Highgate Cemetery, as I stood before a simple, elegant headstone I had commissioned for Margaret. It didn't mention her marriage to Alberto or the Vance name. It simply bore her name and the dates of a life lived in observation. I stood there for a long time, the air smelling of damp earth and the coming rain, feeling the absolute closure of a journey that had begun in a Midtown law office. I had repaid every debt, balanced every ledger, and built a kingdom that was entirely my own. The silence around me wasn't the suffocating stillness of my childhood. It was the quiet, confident peace of a woman who had nothing left to prove. I looked at the city of London in the distance, a gray monolith that I had conquered with nothing but a pen and a plan. I was finally home. The thing about foundations is that they don't care about the feelings of the architect. They only care about the truth of the load. I had spent 8 years learning that lesson, and I had used it to build a life that was structurally sound and emotionally sovereign. My father's fire had run out of wood to burn, and in the ashes, I had found the diamonds of my own resilience. I didn't look back at the wreckage of the Vance legacy as I walked away from the grave. I looked forward at the horizon, where a new project was already waiting for my signature. The bad investment was now the most valuable asset in the room, and I was just getting started. The world was full of fires, but I was the one who knew how to build with the smoke. The ledger was closed, and for the first time in 33 years, the balance was exactly where it needed to be. Today, I stand on my terrace in Belgravia, watching the gray London mist dissolve into a pale, expensive sunlight that reveals the city's sharp, modern edges. The air is cold and carries the scent of damp pavement and the faint floral trail of a perfume I chose for myself, a fragrance that contains no trace of sandalwood or mahogany. I am wearing a cashmere coat that feels like a second skin, a material that provides warmth without the suffocating weight of a father's expectations or the hollow demands of a family name. My fingers trace the smooth, cold edge of a silver key, the key to a house that contains no ghosts, no dining tables of judgment, and no shadows of a sister's $250,000 wedding. The rhythmic ticking of my Patek Philippe is the only measurement of time that matters now. A precise mechanical heartbeat that confirms I am the absolute master of my own hours. The interior of my home is a study in clinical precision and deliberate silence, a space where every object has been selected for its structural integrity and its aesthetic truth. I have replaced the heavy, dark furniture of my childhood with pieces made of brushed steel and tempered glass, materials that do not rot, do not warp, and do not remember the sound of a daughter's dreams being dismissed. I drink my coffee from a hand-thrown ceramic cup that feels solid in my hand, a small, tangible reminder that I have built a life where the quality of the foundation is never in question. There are no decorative elements here that do not serve a purpose. Everything is functional, everything is transparent, and everything is entirely mine. I have created a sanctuary that is emotionally impenetrable. A sovereign state where the only logic is the one I have established through 8 years of unyielding endurance and calculated, sovereign growth. I recently received a digital notification that the final Vance family assets had been successfully liquidated, a transaction that cleared the remaining $2 million debt I chose not to cover with my own capital. The notification arrived with a muted, expensive chime, a sound that carried no more emotional weight than a weather alert or a routine update on the Chicago markets. I watched the data points settle into a final, undeniable zero, realizing that my father's empire had been reduced to a sequence of binary code that no longer had the power to haunt my ledger. I don't feel the need to visit the apartment in Queens or to check on the woman Beatrice has become in the wake of her decorative collapse. They are merely structural remnants of a building I have already vacated, ghosts of an architecture that failed because it was built on the sandy soil of arrogance and the illusion of social capital. Alberto lives in a space that smells of industrial detergent and the persistent exhaust of the nearby expressway, a reality that is as gray and indifferent as the buildings he once thought he owned. He spends his days reading the industry journals I currently edit, searching for the Vance name in the very pages where I have documented his failure as a cautionary tale for the next generation. I authorized his subscription as a clinical gesture of charity, a small, insignificant rounding error in my personal philanthropy budget that costs me nothing and provides him with the only connection to the world he lost. He is no longer the architect. He is a spectator in the life of the daughter he once dismissed as a bad investment, watching the dividends of my success grow from a distance he can never bridge. He has finally learned that a name without collateral is just a collection of letters, a lesson that cost him everything. Beatrice has developed a quiet, desperate rhythm in her new life, working as a junior consultant in a Brooklyn gallery where the name Vance carries the weight of a discredited era. She earns enough to pay for her studio and her storage fees, but the decorative lifestyle she once curated is now a ghost that haunts her social media feeds. I see her occasionally in the background of industry events, a marble finish on a building that is no longer occupied by anyone of consequence. She has learned the value of a dollar she has actually earned, but the transition from a $250,000 wedding to a $45,000 salary has left her with a permanent, brittle exhaustion. I don't hate her. I simply don't have a column for her in my current projections. She is a reminder of the cost of being a guaranteed return in a system that was built on the lie of paternal approval and decorative worth. My office at the Shard is a space of glass and steel that hums with the quiet, efficient energy of a $10 million expansion that shows no signs of slowing down. I spend my days analyzing the distressed assets of empires that, like my father's, were built on the belief that prestige could override the objective reality of a debt-to-equity ratio. I move with a posture that is a vertical declaration of power, my steps measured and without the frantic energy of someone who still has something to prove to a man who is no longer relevant. People in these boardrooms don't see a daughter or a sister. They see a sovereign power who moves with the clinical precision of a surgeon. I have learned that silence is the most powerful load-bearing wall in any structure, and I use it to protect the kingdom I have built in Chicago and London. I am the one who controls the switch. The Margaret Foundation has grown beyond my initial projections, becoming a global infrastructure for women who have been told that their ambition is a fire that will consume them. I use the dividends from my firm to fund interest-free loans for students who, like me in 2015, are facing family rejection for refusing to be decorative elements in someone else's play. Each grant is a brick in a new kind of architecture, one that prioritizes the structural integrity of the individual over the hollow expectations of a legacy. I receive letters from these women, forensic documentation of their own survival, and I file them in a drawer that is now overflowing with the truth of their resilience. Margaret's legacy is no longer a trust fund. It is a movement of women who see everything and say nothing until it is time to change the world. We are building a city that is made of more than just stone, pride, and empty legacies. I often sit at the Macassar table in my conference room late at night, the dark, polished wood reflecting the lights of London like a mirror of my own history. I touch the surface and remember the smell of rosemary-crusted lamb and the sound of my father's fork hitting the plate the night he called me a bad investment. I don't feel the old pain. I feel the weight of the structure I have built on top of that memory, a building that is tall, strong, and perfectly balanced. The table is no longer a theater of my humiliation. It is a trophy of my survival. A tangible representation of the fact that I turned his dismissal into a multi-million-dollar empire. I have balanced the ledger, and the result is a single, undeniable truth that I carry with me into every boardroom and every market. I am no longer looking for a seat. I am the architect of the entire room. To those of you who are currently standing in the wreckage of your own family's delusions, I want you to understand that survival is not a victory of emotion, but a victory of persistence. You are likely being told that you are a liability to a legacy that doesn't even have the integrity to sustain itself, a fire that will burn through the family's hard-earned currency. They want you to believe that your ambition is a high-risk venture without dividends, but they are only afraid of the light you will bring to the rooms they have kept in the dark for 40 years. I didn't reach this plateau by being lucky, or by seeking a revenge that would have only tethered me to their failure. I reached it by becoming the architect of my own sovereign reality, documenting the debt while they were busy spending the social capital they didn't actually possess. Your worth is a constant you alone possess. Justice is not a feeling that arrives with a shout or a dramatic confrontation. It is a mathematical inevitability that settles into place when you stop waiting for an apology and start building your own structure. It arrives when the bad investment becomes the only person with the power to sign the checks, and the guaranteed return is left with nothing but storage fees and rotting organic matter. My father's fire didn't consume me. It merely refined the steel of my intent until I was hard enough to dismantle his empire without raising my voice. I have learned that the only logic that matters is the truth of the load, and the only foundation that holds is the one you build for yourself in the cold, gray hours of the morning. I am no longer a daughter sitting in the shadows of a chandelier. I am the one who controls the light and the dark. I am Claudia Vance, and the ledger of my life is finally, perfectly balanced after 8 years of calculated endurance and clinical focus. I don't tell you this to inspire you or to suggest that your journey will be easy, but to provide a forensic confirmation that the people who try to drown you are often the ones who teach you how to build. I am standing in the light of a future I drafted in the shadows of an Upper East Side brownstone, and the view from here is exactly as clear as I imagined it would be when I signed for my loans. You have your own table, your own dinner, and your own father who is currently miscalculating your potential with the practiced ease of a man who doesn't understand the fire he is starting. Do not argue, do not cry, and do not look for a seat at their table. Simply build something better. The journey from the dining room in Manhattan to the terrace in Belgravia has been a long, exhausting documentation of the power of a woman who refuses to be invisible. I have survived the structural failure of my family and used the rubble to build a kingdom that is entirely my own, a sovereign state that requires no recognition from the men who tried to erase me. The air is clear now, the sandalwood is gone, and the only scent left is the sharp, clean ozone of a world that is finally making sense. I am looking at the horizon, where a new project is already waiting for my signature, and I know that the foundation is sound. What was the exact moment you realized that your family's definition of your value was nothing more than a structural lie designed to keep you from building your own empire? Share your story in the comments, and let us document the truth together.